This is sort of a futuristic talk, but I think the ideas may have some interesting applications for communicating about future technologies, even in the relatively near term. I'll start with a few general remarks about language before moving into my main topic of what comes after language. Obviously, language is one of the main things distinguishing human beings from other animals. Dogs and apes and chickens and parrots and so forth. These animals do have their own languages, which can be quite sophisticated in some ways. But these animal languages, they lack some of the unique and powerful characteristics of human language. They don't have the recursive phrase structure that lets us humans construct and communicate really complex conceptual structures. Now, dolphins and whales might have languages as sophisticated as ours, but even so, their languages are very different and lacking some of the really unique features of human language. Dolphins and whales may communicate more using continuous flowing waveforms rather than breaking everything into discrete chunks like phonemes, words, and sentences and paragraphs like we do. Now, communicating in continuous waveforms is really cool. Probably has a lot of advantages. Continuous forms seem to be better for communicating emotion, which is why we communicate emotion so much with gesture and with facial expressions and tones, rather than with the discrete breakdown into words and sentences and so forth. But the way human language breaks things down into pieces, that ties in very well with our analytical habit of conceptually breaking things down into pieces, and with our tool building capability of building complex things out of smaller pieces. There's a lot of consilience between the way our language works and the way our thinking works. I've often wondered about the cavemen who first invented language. You can imagine these cavemen sitting around in their caves and speculating and worrying about the future changes their invention might cause. Maybe these cavemen who invented language for the first time, maybe they wondered whether language was even going to be a good thing at all. Maybe they wondered if language would somehow mess up their wonderful caveman way of life. They might have foreseen some of the future implications of language. They might have foreseen that language would enable more complex social structures, that language would enable better passage of knowledge from one generation to the next. They might have foreseen that language would let them better orchestrate an attack on a rival tribe or a mammoth they were trying to capture. But you wonder, did these clever cavemen who invented language, did they foresee Shakespeare, William Burroughs, YouTube comment spam, differential calculus, mathematical logic, C++ programming? I doubt it. If you're really smart and think really hard, you can see into the future using the power of reason and intuition. But even so, you can only see so far. In many ways, we're now in a similar position to these cavemen who first invented language, when we speculate about the future situations that our current technologies might lead to. We can see a ways into the future, we can guess, we can speculate, and that's useful. But after a certain distance in the future, things are going to happen that we totally lack the capability to comprehend. Now, with that in mind, I want to pose a somewhat adventurous question. What comes after language? What's the next major change in communication? At a certain point in history, Our predecessors communicated by pointing, by going, by grunting and groaning, by gestures, by music maybe, not by language. Now we communicate using complex phrase structure syntax. We write books, we write equations, we write programs. Language is amazing, but what comes next? My suggestion is both simple and radical. In the future, the distinction between linguistic utterances and minds is likely to dissolve. In the not too distant future, a linguistic utterance is simply going to be a mind with a particular focus and a particular goal system. A linguistic utterance is going to be a mind focusing on taking certain content and translating it into forms appropriate for comprehension by various recipient minds. To explain this idea a little better, let me tell you how I came up with it. I came up with this way of thinking about the future of language in the course of my work on the OpenCog AI system. Now, OpenCog is an open source software system. My colleagues and I are building this with a goal of creating a human level AGI and ultimately an artificial general intelligence that can think much better than human beings. We're now using OpenCog to control video game characters in an online virtual world. Over the next couple of years, we'll be working with roboticist David Hansen to use OpenCog to control humanoid robots. Now, what happens when two OpenCog systems want to communicate with each other? Two OpenCog systems, two computer programs using OpenCog, when they want to communicate with each other, they don't need to use words and sentences and so forth. One OpenCog doesn't need to turn its thoughts into a linear series of words, which are then received by the other OpenCog system, that then turns the linear series of words back into ideas. No. Two OpenCog systems, when they want to communicate, can just transmit chunks of mind from one to the other. In technical terms, they can transmit semantic graphs. An OpenCog represents its mind in terms of nodes and links. Nodes and links connected to each other in a certain pattern. When one OpenCog wants to communicate to another, it can just send a bunch of nodes and links to the other one. Now, of course, it's not quite that simple. You can't just take a chunk of mind from one guy and put it straight into another guy's mind, because different minds use different ways of representing the same things. Some translation has got to happen. If I just took a chunk of my thought and somehow put it into your mind, a lot of things would seem alien and confusing, because that chunk of my thought would refer to a lot of other things in my mind that weren't in your mind. So there's a couple of ways to get around this difficulty. One method that I made up in the 1990s, I called Psynese. The Psynese method of transmitting thoughts directly from mind to mind requires some sort of universal reference mind that acts like a cognitive dictionary. In this method, if I want to transmit a chunk of thoughts into your mind, I would take that chunk of thoughts, I would translate it into the terms of the universal reference mind, the mind dictionary, and that would then go into your mind. So if everyone understood the thought processes of the universal reference mind, they could use that to mediate communications between each other. It's sort of like having a language, but you don't need to string things out in a line with words and sentences. you can keep everything on the level of exchanging semantic graphs. You just use some universal reference mind to standardize the meaning of the semantic graphs. That's kind of a good idea, but wouldn't it be better if you could transmit thought stuff from mind to mind in more of a peer-to-peer fashion? And I think that may be possible. Imagine if a chunk of idea out of my mind was not something inert, but rather was a sort of intelligent agent. It's a collection of ideas that's spun out of my mind. It travels to various other minds, and then that chunk of ideas figures out how to translate itself into a form that your mind can understand. In other words, the linguistic utterance is a semantic graph representing certain ideas, and with the intelligence to re-express itself in a form that the recipient mind can understand. The linguistic utterance itself is an intelligent system whose goal in life is to make itself understood by whoever chooses to receive it. This may seem strange relative to the way we communicate now, but the way we communicate now would have seemed really strange to the cavemen who came before us, before the invention of language. It's a perfectly sensible design pattern for a communication system. It doesn't work given the way the human brain functions, because we have no way to get ideas out of our brains except by typing them on a keyboard or speaking them with our mouth, making sound waves go through the air. But once we have brain implants to put in our heads, once we have uploaded ourselves into computers, many more avenues will be available to us. We can communicate directly mind to mind, and we can solve the mind to mind translation problem by making our linguistic utterances smart enough to carry out the translation themselves in a context appropriate way. Now, that's my best guess for what comes after language. Impromptu minds synthesized on the fly with the goals of translating particular networks of thought into the internal languages of the recipients. So if I really stretch my pathetic, stupid human brain, if I stretch it as far as I can sort of dimly imagine what this kind of futuristic thought and communication system might be like. This would weave together a group of minds into a really interesting and unique kind of collective mind, a kind of global brain. But I cannot foresee the particulars of what this kind of communication might lead to. Not any better than a bunch of cavemen could foresee Henry Miller, Reddit, or string theory. Now I'll pose you one more question, which I will not, however, answer for you. Those of us who are writing about the future now, who are writing blogs and writing tweets and writing essays and books, how can we write about the future now in a way that starts to move toward a future in which linguistic utterances and minds are the same thing? How can we write now in a way that works toward a future where what we write dynamically and intelligently helps figure out how others can best understand it? The answer to this question isn't obvious, but one would think that with all the abilities offered by Web 2.0 and 3.0 and the AI technology we now have, we may be able to somewhat gradually move in this direction and break down the boundary between linguistic utterance and mind. Anyway, that's that's my vision of what comes after language. You may have your own, and if so, I'd be curious to hear it. That's all for now. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I don't know if there's time to take a question or two, then I'm certainly willing to.
There's probably only one. We're running a bit late. Okay, so who wants to? Okay, the guy standing up.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very interesting what you said.
I can't hear that.
Okay.
Can you just
we have a
ask the
microphone
question?
for questions?
You wanted to go for
I
it.
thought we had.
I do.
Ask you the picture.
You're welcome.
Just from there. Yeah.
From here. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, it was very interesting what you said. Like right now I'm standing up and you're reading me by seeing me. So looking at my body language, you're already observing something, and so we're already there. Thank you.
That was a comment.
Anyway, all right.
It was the right person.
Thanks. I think you said you were running out of time. I think the schedule's a bit wrong, so we need to start with the next
We
person.
actually have 3 minutes, because I think our next speaker, I allowed 5 minutes in between for this.
Okay, the guy over there had his hand up before. Do you want to come to the front and get the mic?
I can say something in dog language.
Hi Ben. It's
Stand over here so
Ricardo
I can
here.
see him. Right.
Oh, great.
Yeah, there you go.
Hi Ben.
See someone.
Yeah. I have a question about sort of what is lost in translation when we go from mind to mind. Let's see, for example, Shakespeare would say, you know, from fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. So somebody 10 years ago would say, I think you should have a baby. Nowadays we would have some kind of abbreviation or something on Twitter, you know, DCKU, whatever that means, the same thing. So there are different subtleties in the way humans communicate. That's not only personal, but I think it seems like a return to Shakespeare when you say we can use semantic graphs to translate chunks of mind. You know, it seems like Shakespeare was translating chunks of thoughts in a very beautiful, poetic way. Is poetry lost in this process of chunks of mind? Have you thought about it? I mean, the subtlety of human communication.
I would imagine that the particular beauty of poetry as we know it would be lost when we move to this kind of communication. I mean, poetry is about playing with the interaction between the linguistic level, the level of words and sounds and so forth, and the level of emotions and concept. And of course, if you get rid of the level of words and sounds, you're not going to have that interplay between words and sounds versus ideas anymore. Now, would you have some future analog of poetry, some interplay between the contents of the semantic graphs and the limitations and particularities of that semantic graph medium? Probably you would. You might have some future analog of poetry that's hard to imagine. I mean, if you think of poetry in the abstract sense, as communication that is as much about the interplay between form and content and the emotional or unconscious evocation as it is about the explicit meaning. I think you could have poetry in that broad sense, but it wouldn't be in the same sense. And I mean, I think you could say the same thing, that going beyond handwriting to typing loses something. Because if I read something in handwriting, I can tell something about your mood and your feeling for the way you wrote in handwriting. I lose that when you type. And that's true. On the other hand, when we move to typography, we got the ability to use all sorts of different fonts. We got the ability to include pictures from everywhere pasted into our documents and so forth. I mean, there's always something unique in each mode of communication, and something unique that we gain in the move to a new mode of communication.
Thank you, Ben. It was a pleasure being able to Skype with you. Everyone appreciate it. I'm sorry we can't turn the camera around for you to see everyone, but they're here and appreciative for you being able to do this so late at night. You look very alert nonetheless. Thank you.